DCT. All right. Those are important, right? You said? All right. So kidneys being hypoperfused, less sodium is filtered, right, into the glomerulus, into the Bowman space, into the tubules, which means less sodium gets to the macular denser. Macular can sense that, and they can use that as a marker, right, to tell them, right, there's low filtration, low perfusion. Then it sends signal to the JG cells to release renin. All right. Then symbiotic, like you mentioned, through beta 1 can directly stimulate the JG cells release renin. And then also there's a regulation, right, in the afferent arteriole and the mesangial cells. So when pressure is low, the mechanism receptors stretch less. They can also directly, right, stimulate renin, right? Okay. You have to know that. Yeah, always. Endocrine cells have inputs, they have signals. So you have to know the signal. Because the signal will tell you what will activate the pathway and what will shut it down. And right. So depending on the clinical scenario I give you, I just need to figure out what signal will be affected. For instance, patient is bleeding. Why would they have high renin? Okay, I know pressure is low, baroreflex is activated, sympathetic activation. Oh, pressure is low, less stretching of the mechanism receptors, right? Renin release. Oh, pressure is low, decreased GFR, less sodium gets to macular denser, renin will be released. Yeah. So, all right. So renin is released. What happens next? Okay, convert angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Where is angiotensinogen coming from? It's from the liver. From the liver. What things can stimulate angiotensinogen release by the liver? Okay, probably. But remember, angiotensinogen is a protein, right? So OCP, right, can do that. One of the mechanisms, right, by which OCP, because OCP can cause hypertension. Yeah, estrogen use or even hormone replacement therapy, right, that contains estrogen can cause hypertension. Yeah, one of the mechanisms is that OCP can stimulate angiotensinogen release by the liver. The same way they can also stimulate hepatocytes to make what? To make coagulation factors. And that's why, right, patients taking OCP, HRT, they are gonna have what hypercoagulable state, and they're at risk for DVT-P, right? So same thing it can also happen with angiotensinogen, and that can lead to hypertension in that case. All right. So go ahead. So renin converts angiotensinogen towards angiotensin 1, right? Right. Well, how does it convert it to angiotensin 1? How? What does it do? Yeah, what does renin do to angiotensinogen to convert it to angiotensin 1? Yeah, what does it do to it? What's the difference between fibrinogen and fibrin? Prothrombin and thrombin. What's the difference between them? What's the difference between angiotensinogen and angiotensin 1? What's the difference between trypsinogen and trypsin? How do they convert them to the active form? Oh, right, you cleave them, right? So The O gene is the inactive form, correct? Or what we call pro-enzyme form or zymogen form. Then we're going to have an enzyme that can cleave, like a protease, that will cleave, remove that O gene part, right, to convert it to what? A more active form, correct? So renin is an enzyme. That's my point. Don't forget that renin is an enzyme. So it's going to cleave angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1, right? Okay, all right. So, yeah, angiotensin 1 is made, what happens? In the lungs. Okay, so angiotensin 2 now does what? Which receptor does it use in the blood vessel? To be 81. Angiotensin has its own receptor. Yeah, right. So there are two 81 receptors, angiotensin 2 receptors rather. There's 1 and 2. Good. So 81 is the one on the vessels, which also uses, I believe, uses GQ, right? Like alpha 1. Okay, so it can vasoconstrict. Vasoconstriction increases TPR, right? Right, and which will what? Increase mean arterial pressure, which will increase perfusion pressure. Very good. Now, what does it do? What else does it do? Yeah, what else does it do? Other function. So it constricts what? It constricts both, but it constricts efferent more than afferent. You get it? Yeah. So it can constrict both efferent and afferent arteriole, but it's going to constrict efferent renal arteriole more than afferent. Yeah. And by doing that, right, GFR, right, will increase. So try to maintain GFR. So that's good there. What else does 82 do? Which layer of the adrenal gland does it work? Glomerulosa. And what does it do there? Okay, stimulates release of aldosterone. What enzyme does it stimulate in the glomerulosa? Yeah, it's gonna stimulate aldosterone synthase. That's what it stimulates. Yeah, it's gonna stimulate aldosterone synthase, and that will increase aldosterone synthesis, right? And release in the glomerulosa. Yeah, all right. So, which means unlike the other hormones made in the adrenal cortex, right, aldosterone is under the regulation of RAAS, not directly ACTH. It's under direct regulation of angiotensin 2. Yeah, all right. Another thing 82 does is it can stimulate the release of what? ADH. And this is something that most people don't remember. And antidiuretic hormone. Yes, it can stimulate the release of ADH, which ADH itself is also a vasoconstrictor, as well as going to increase, right, reabsorption of water. Yeah, to contribute to volume. 82 also works on the kidneys itself, on the renal tubules. PCT. It can stimulate sodium co-transporters, right, at the proximal convoluted tubule, which will increase sodium and water reabsorption, right? It can do that. Yeah. And I think also on the vessels, it can, besides directly constricting the vessels, it can stimulate the release of endothelin, right? And endothelin too will contribute to the vasoconstriction, right? Yeah, in that case. So 82, yeah, important. All right, so release aldosterone, what happens? What does aldosterone do? Mm-hmm. Okay, okay. What else does it do? Okay. Mm-mm. ADH does that. What does aldosterone do in the principal cells? Sodium. How will aldosterone stimulate sodium reabsorption? What does it do? First of all, how does aldosterone work? Mechanism of action. What kind of hormone is it? Where is its receptor? Yeah, ultimately, right. Ultimately, it wants to regulate blood volume. Very good. Ultimately, that's the goal. But where is the receptor for aldosterone? Where is it in the cell? In the principal cells, where is the receptor going to be located? Where? Right. In the principal cells, will aldosterone receptor be? What? RAAS? Why nucleus? It is steroid hormone. Right. It is steroid. I mean, there are two possibilities for hormone receptors. Either it's on the membrane of the cell or it's in the cell. Right. So which ones have their receptors on the membrane? Those that cannot enter the cell, that can't cross the cell membrane. Those that are water soluble. Hormones that are lipid soluble, they can cross the cell membrane, so their receptors will be in the cell. Make sense? Right. So it enters the cell. So when it enters the nucleus, it's going to what? Turn on the gene for epithelial sodium channels. Remember, for hormones that have nuclear receptor, their receptors are what? They are transcription factors, specific transcription factors, right? That regulate certain genes in the nucleus. So in this case, the target for aldosterone is actually sodium. It regulates how the kidneys handle sodium. That's what aldosterone does. And since we know water will follow sodium, right? Indirectly, It regulates how the kidneys handle water. But the primary target is not water, it's sodium for aldosterone. That's the primary target. So it turns on the gene for epithelial sodium channels, which are channels that are not gated, basically. So they're going to be synthesized and embedded on the membrane, right? Apical membrane of the principal cells, and that will allow what? The passive diffusion or facilitated diffusion, right? Of sodium, united sodium into the cells. And if sodium is reabsorbed, what will follow sodium? Chloride will follow sodium, and then water will now follow. The one that primarily regulates water is ADH. The primary target for ADH will be water. Aquaporins will be embedded, right, on the membrane, and water, free water, will be reabsorbed. But aldosterone is sodium. It's right, how the kidneys handle sodium. That's what it does. Right. So right. And then yeah, so sodium, blood chloride, water, and then that will help, right? Kind of expand the volume, intravascular volume, get more blood back to the heart, maintain pressure and stuff like that. So, and if I'm bringing a sodium, a positively charged molecule, to prevent what? Having a net positive, too much positive charge on one side of the membrane, then the cell will get rid of what? Potassium, right? So potassium will be coming out in the opposite direction. And that's why sodium, aldosterone is what? Is potassium wasting. It's exchanging sodium, right? For potassium, or exchanging potassium for sodium. Getting sodium in, getting potassium out, as well as hydrogen ion. Yeah, you get it? RAS, RAS is high yield. I don't know. It's just renal, cardiovascular, everything. Yeah, RAS is just there. It's just there, right? Regulating blood pressure. So it's super, super important. You have to know everything about the steps, everything about the hormones how they work to the minutest detail. Yeah, just love that pathway. So, what medications can affect RAS? RAS. Okay, 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 okay. Mm-hmm. Aldosterone. What do you have drugs that work on aldosterone? Okay, spironolactone, eplerenone, right? Yeah, so aldosterone receptor blockers. And they also have what, drugs that actually inhibit what the sodium channels themselves. Amiloride, triamterene, correct? Yeah. So those are going to be right drugs that can affect RAS. Why do we use ACE inhibitors ARBs to treat patients with diabetic nephropathy or proteinuria or nephrotic syndrome? Why? Why are ACE inhibitors ARBs beneficial in patients with proteinuria, either due to diabetic nephropathy or they have nephrotic syndrome, glomerular disease? How would it do that? How? Which pressure? Okay. How will it decrease the intraglomerular pressure? So if decrease angiotensin 2, that would do what? Dilate efferent arteriole, correct? And then what happens if GFR drops? If my GFR drops, how much pressure or how much protein will be filtered into the tubes? Less. Right. So the answer always go back to the basics. How does it work initially? What will happen if I block ACE? So truly, I'm not asking you about directly about okay the disease itself. I'm asking you about the mechanism of action of AT2 or the opposite, reverse. Yeah, always go back there. Yeah, that's why ACE inhibitors and ARBs like they call them renoprotective right drugs. Because if the pressure in the glomerulus is too high, right, there will be more filtration of protein over time. Proteins themselves can damage the tubes, and that will lead to right worsening renal function. But by blocking that, you're decreasing that filtration pressure. That helps patients cope better, or the kidneys, right, at least cope better. Mhm. All right. Why does spironolactone cause gynecomastia or hypoandrogenism as a side effect? Okay, so what does that have to do with androgens? What do androgens and aldosterone have in common? So what else do they have in common? What else do they have in common? Hmm? Steroid. Okay, so because they are both steroid, what else do they have in common? They both have their nuclear receptors will be where? Both in the nucleus. Right. So if I make a drug to block one steroid receptor in the nucleus, but that drug is not specific, it can probably block other right steroid receptors in the nucleus, including androgen receptors. And that's why spironolactone can cause hypoandrogenism, gynecomastia in men, decreased libido, things like that, erectile dysfunction. Yes. Eplerenone is more specific for aldosterone receptor. So if somebody is on spironolactone and they're developing hypoandrogenism, right, or hypoandrogenic side effect, then you switch to what you can switch to eplerenone, which is more specific for